Hello, this is your instructor Elia Mahoney again, and I am starting part two of our lecture for week two. So I believe we left off with watching Suffer the Children, which is again a documentary on the unimaginable conditions that 2,800 patients were undergoing, with such limited resources. So again, we start seeing really civil rights and disability rights really meshing in the 70s, and we started actually with 1973. So in your timeline, you should see 1973, which is the Rehabilitation Act. And basically, this act prohibits disability discrimination by any federal agency, federal contractors, and other recipients of federal financial assistance. So types of prohibited discrimination can include in the areas of employment, education, building accessibility, as well as health, welfare, and social services. 2 years later, we actually end up with a landmark act that actually shined light in regards to the education of students with disabilities. And this one is called the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, or IDEA. And with IDEA, it actually requires the states to provide a free, appropriate public education to children with disabilities. Again, this is the first in ever in the history of United States that actually guaranteed that to students with disabilities. And in fact, this remains the main law that regulates special education. So you should already be familiar with the 6 principles of the IDEA law from your reading in the textbook, but just really quickly, I'm going to go briefly over them just as a refresher. So the idea of free, appropriate public education meant that no student could be turned away from public schools on the basis of disability. So they needed to receive a public education at no cost to them or the family. So this was, again, controversial at the time because there were some individuals with very significant disabilities who had never been taught within the public educational system, as they had been educated in institutions or not educated at all. And now they were for the first time receiving access to public schools. The responsibility to address the educational needs of students with disabilities laid upon the government, state, and the local district. The second, which is appropriate evaluation, meant that assessments for students with special needs or assessments for special education in general could not be found discriminatory in any manner. Remember, looking back at some of those early assessments to identify students who might be struggling with education, and if you recall, they were extremely culturally biased. So, in order to prevent something like that happening again, we really wanted to ensure that the law really upheld appropriate evaluation for everyone, and that basically it was illegal to do otherwise. This is, however, easier said than done because many of the standardized assessments we use today still have some inherent bias in them. The third part of IDA is Individualized Education Plan. And otherwise, this is known as an IEP. And again, the IEP is the summary of a student's entire educational program and how it is designed to meet their individualized needs. And we will definitely learn a little bit more about that with our next class session. The fourth aspect of IDEA is the least restrictive environment. And this means that students should be educated in the environment that is as similar as possible to students without disabilities. So as educators, we really need to look at the general education class as the preferred placement, and then we can move to more restrictive or a different setting only as needed. And the reason why it was so important to really consider the least restrictive environment, honestly, came from the fact that many medical professionals were very happy and really quickly went from 0 to 60. A child perhaps like Johnny that we saw the video in Suffer the Children, who maybe had, ADHD or specific learning disability, instead of being educated in the least restrictive environment, i.e., a gen ed class with maybe some supplemental support, was instead being really restricted, and his education was being very much stunted because he was in an institution with students whose academic skills or cognitive skills were not as developed as his. So we really wanted to ensure that we put some safeguards to ensure that, again, we considered the least restrictive environment. The fifth aspect of IDEA is parent participation. Parent and student participation, I should say, in the decision making of their educational plan. And again, this was very controversial at the time because it was assumed that parents would be unqualified to participate in decisions about their children. And then students were added in a later revision of the law as important stakeholders in that conversation as well. It is extremely important that parents participate, no matter the lack of perhaps educational background when it comes to their child's educational program. But again, the law wanted to ensure that there were safeguards put in place that did not override the parents' opinion or feelings or concerns in regards to the education their child was receiving. And finally, the procedural state safeguards were also part of IDEA, and this refers to disagreements within the team for how a student should be educated. The safeguards and systems set in place were what we refer today now as due process. And again, the law wanted to ensure that if anyone or parents did not agree to any part of the IEP, the educational program, that they could be protected and voice their concerns and their opinions and be heard, and perhaps have some actions taken into play. Okay, now we are moving over. Actually, we're jumping over to the 90s with the Americans with Disabilities Act. So in 1990, we have a National Civil Rights Act outlining discrimination against individuals with disabilities. So remember, in 1973, it was against the law to discriminate only within programs that received federal funding. The Americans with Disabilities Act now applies across the board. So many people went to the state capitol to testify of either their inability to access their environment or the discrimination that they were facing. For example, a Vietnam veteran who had been paralyzed during the war came home using a wheelchair. He testified about his inability to not only get out of his housing project, but to get on a bus or even off the street curbs because, there was no accessibility, i.e. ramps. Another young woman with cerebral palsy told the senators about her experience in her local movie theater where she was not allowed to attend because of her disability. When her mother called the theater to protest that this attitude sounded like discrimination, the theater owner basically stated, "I don't care what it sounds like." So we're going to watch a short clip explaining the story behind these Capitol steps right here. This is actually a very powerful picture, and what essentially became known as the Capitol Crawl. If you will just hold on a second. Oh my God.
Welcome back. The second part of the film takes us through the 1980s to the summer of 1990. Encouraged by their earlier success, but knowing there was a lot more to do, disability rights activists continued to fight for one important thing, a law that would make it possible for people with disabilities to be guaranteed inclusion in every program. The film ends in July of 1990 when President George H.W. Bush
Okay, so let me pull up our ADA slide. Okay, so,
Mexico
oh,
started writing its independence
excuse me. Okay, take two. So, as discussed, the Capitol crawl again took place on March 12, 1990, with over 1,000 protesters. Many of them abandoned their wheelchairs and crawled up the stairs as a way to show the inaccessibility of many public buildings and transportation of the time. Again, this is 1990. The act, fortunately was signed into law by President George W. Bush Sr., July 26, 1990, and we saw five major outcomes from this law. So those five outcomes included employment, which required employers to provide employees reasonable accommodations and protections against discrimination based on disability or ability. The second outcome was public accessibility. So, sets of standards for construction of accessible public facilities, otherwise known as ADA panels, ADA space layouts for wheelchair securement, and such on buses and ramps and elevators, became part of the law. Well, as you can imagine, a lot of businesses were not very thrilled that they would have to retrofit, that they would have to really spend money to make sure that their business buildings were accessible to all. The third outcome was public accommodations. So this actually protected against discrimination in public places and works on bringing pre-existing buildings into compliance, as well as allowing service animals in public places. Because we know that there are some buildings that, have, they're part of history or whatnot. So we need to ensure, though, that they are accessible and that public accommodations are made. Um, the next one is telecommunications. This is actually the last outcome, and it requires all telecommunication companies in the United States to take steps to ensure functionally equivalent services for consumers with disabilities. So, this basically provides access to TTY, which is a teletypewriter, and TDD, which is telecommunication devices for the deaf. Okay. Then we move on to 1996 with the Shonda Smith consent decree. Now, this was the big enchilada. This is what really basically catapulted everything into motion within LAUSD. So in 1996, we had again, the Shonda Smith consent decree, and this consent decree became a huge landmark case against LAUSD. This was a class action lawsuit between Shonda Smith and a large number of other special education students within LA Unified. The, and basically, with this, Shonda Smith was a student who had gone through her education in the LAUSD and had many instances in which the IDEA, or the federal law that regulates special education, was not fulfilled. So, due to this, Shonda had gone many years without timely assessments. She had repeated the 10th grade twice and was reading at a third grade level, meaning that she simply was being passed from one grade level to the next. Shonda was not educated in the least restrictive environment and did not receive fair access to education. So, as a result, the school district settled this large class action lawsuit and agreed to 18 different outcomes. I have highlighted some of the outcomes here on this slide. Let's see. So, in addition to the 18 different outcomes, an independent monitor was also hired. It was agreed that this person would not work for the school district, but would would be funded through the settlement. So the independent monitor's job was to monitor the implementation of all the 18 outcomes. So to put this into perspective, this case took place in 1996, and it is now 2018. And LAUSD still has an independent monitor working on monitoring the implementation of these outcomes because they have not yet met compliance with all of them. Okay, so okay, so one of the outcomes was the placement of students with low incidence disabilities. And low incidence disabilities in this case refers to students who perhaps have cerebral palsy and are blind, who, those are the disabilities that are not as really occurring throughout the population as, like, let's say, specific learning disability. So the outcome basically stated that at least 52% of students with low incidence disabilities should spend about 40 to 100% of their day in the general education setting. Well, needless to say, that really is not being met. Students, again, let's see here, the agreement set was that just over half of students with moderate to severe disabilities would receive, again, their education in the gen ed setting. However, though, the way that the outcome was written, LAUSD was expected to have half of their students with moderate to severe disabilities in a general education setting for at least 40%. So as you may imagine, this actually is not a lot. And, it's once part of it was met, then they kind of reverted back. And we are, or personally, I'm seeing IEPs where sometimes there will be 0% in a gen ed setting, meaning that the student is not even allowed to eat alongside their typically developing peers. I've gone to other schools where it's 9% of the day within the general education population, so they are really counting passing periods and the such, which, again, there really isn't a lot of substance there to being in a gen ed setting and, passing periods and whatnot. In 2012, there was a revision, and here's what the revision looks like now. It basically allowed for the focus of the objective to go towards special education centers run by the school district. So those are schools that are only for students who receive special education services. And the expectation was that the enrollment of these centers would decrease by 33% over 3 years. At the same time, students who were at co-located schools, these are schools where there is a special education center on the same campus as a general education school, would participate in the general education portion of the campus for an average of 12% of the day. So as you can see, there was a big difference. And the revision, they really wanted to ensure that because they could not meet that 40%, it went to a minimum of 12%. So again, the outcome went from 40% of the day with just over half of the students to now an average of 12% of the day overall. So as a side note, 12% of a 6-hour school day equals roughly about 43 minutes. So if we subtract recess, nutrition, and lunch, which equals about 60 minutes total, we are left with 36 minutes at minimum. Students with moderate to severe disabilities are integrated with their typically developing peers. So again, I am an LUSD integration teacher, and even this bare minimum is just too much to ask teachers at times. I get excuses such as others do not need to see how they eat. I have really been told that. They don't understand what's happening anyway, as they're referring to the student with moderate to severe disabilities. They like it better inside, as an excuse for why they're not taking students with moderate to severe disabilities, within the general vicinity. or they like talking to adults better than other students. Um, these excuses are very prevalent. Some teachers eventually allow me to support them to increase quality integration for their students, but it really is sometimes it's like pulling teeth. Okay, so now we are in 2006, and in 2006, we actually have the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is an international treaty and has now been signed by most countries throughout the world. It is a comprehensive human rights convention, international development tool, and is at the heart of the disability rights movement. This convention has served as the major catalyst in the global movement, from viewing persons with disabilities as objects of charity, medical treatment, and social protection towards really viewing them as full and equal members of society with human rights. There are 8 guiding principles of this convention, which includes a focus on basic civil rights, lack of non discrimination, full inclusion in society, and accessibility. So there is a map where it delineates which countries have signed, and according to the legend, the countries in yellow mean that a country has signed the convention, but it has not yet committed to any legally binding actions or commitment towards these actions. So this basically is the least action that can be taken. And guess who's in that area? Well, the United States. Although they passed the Americans with Disabilities Act and the IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, we have not signed on to the convention or onto the rights of persons with disabilities. And when you're looking at that map, when you look at the comparison around the world, you can see that the United States is not as far ahead as we would like to think that we are within this area. And then in 2013, we actually have the Stop Hurting Kids campaign against restraint and seclusion in schools. So this is actually a national campaign to end restraint and seclusion abuse in schools. Many students across the United States have been at risk of restraint and seclusion techniques that have been proven to hold literally no educational or therapeutic value, despite evidence-based positive alternatives. The Stop Hurting Kids campaign and bill is still in Congress and not yet passed. If passed, this bill would make it so that restraint and seclusion in schools be outlawed. Currently, there are not many laws that regulate how restraint and seclusion are done and how it is reported. Okay. And then finally, the latest that we have is actually in 2017. It's from the Alabama School Board. So I'm not sure if you remember this quote, but if you don't, it was actually from I believe 1924. So, mentally disabled students represent an unassimilable accumulation of human clinkers, ballast, driftwood, or derelicts, which seriously retards the rate of progress of the entire class, and which often constitutes a positive irritant to the teacher and other pupils. So, let's look at Alabama School Board and what their conversation and how it went. And I want you to kind of compare what's happening in that meeting with kind of this quote from 1924. So I ask you to bear with me because my computer's very old and she's on her way out. So I'm trying to take it slow with her. So let me see. Okay, so I got it loaded and here we go. Um, yeah. So yeah, this board member actually has been serving for about a decade, and she really was, adamant about trying to have the students with special needs, basically weeded out, have them tested, and then if they show some quote unquote deficiencies, they automatically don't even have a chance to be educated in the least restrictive environment. Instead, it was like straight, going back, again, backwards to, if you show a deficiency, you're going to go to this specific setting just for you. And I'm not saying that, this board member's concerns are not legitimate. Absolutely, there is legitimacy. However, part of me also does have some really high standards and expectations for her, given that, she represents a majority of the schools in Alabama, and her thought process really seemed stuck in, very antiquated, stuck in the past. Okay, so with that, we actually start moving forward into the disability categories under IDEA. So, as you recall, it was again in 1975 that this law truly was geared to ensuring that there were again those six safeguards, and that students with disabilities were given a chance to be educated and receive an education that was free and appropriate. So, under IDEA, we have these 13 categories, and as you can see, they list autism, specific learning disability, speech or language impairment, emotional disturbance, traumatic brain injury, visual impairment, hearing impairment, deafness, deaf blindness, orthopedic impairment, intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, other health impairment, and then the last one, which is highlighted in green, is developmental delay. Now, it's really important that I know that there aren't, um, let me see, hold on, I just lost my train of thought. Okay, developmental delay, I just really want to make sure that I point out that that eligibility is only specific for children ages 0 to 3 years of age. Okay, so anyone that displays a challenge between 0 to 3, doesn't matter if they have a visual impairment or an intellectual disability or autism, they all qualify under the category of developmental delay. Once the child reaches the age of 3, then more a more specific disability category or label is assigned to them. But just for this purpose, I really want to make sure that I highlight that developmental delay is only for those that are 0 to 3 years of age. Okay, so what are some other maybe perhaps special needs that are not covered under IDEA? Well, if we look back at this category, you might kind of feel like maybe there are some students who are left out, even though they might need some additional supports or considerations and plans, but are not considered students, again, who would be covered by special education. So, one such category includes students who are gifted or high achieving. So, even though they need differentiated curriculum, because they need that challenge, they do not receive support from special education programs. So I just want to consider something for a minute. Let's consider that students who have functional disabilities, perhaps they use a wheelchair and they might need some accommodations, but if they're able to access the curriculum and the standards, then they wouldn't necessarily need special education program. So similarly to a student who can have a diagnosis of attention deficit disorder or bipolar disorder. And although, again, they are recognized medically as disabilities, they may not need special education services to access the curriculum specifically. So these are considered kind of like those functional categories because they can, yes, they have a disability, but they're able to access the curriculum. Again, the same can be said for students who are struggling or are considered to be at risk for a variety of different reasons, whether it's a lack of attendance, poverty, difficulty in the home, or any other factors. Whatever those factors are, these students, again, do not necessarily um, uh, are considered to be students with disabilities. We might also have students who are struggling academically due to learning English as a second language or have limited experience with our educational system. Again, those students might struggle sometimes in school, but that does not necessarily warrant that they require special education services. Okay, so special education credentials here in California are um, separated into the following categories. We actually have 6 special education credentials, and they include the mild to moderate credential. And this credential allows teachers to focus on supporting students with learning disabilities, mild to moderate intellectual disabilities, or other health impairments, as well as students with emotional challenges. Then we have the moderate to severe category. So those who are pursuing a moderate to severe credential can work with students who require definitely much more significant supports and have extensive needs. And again, we're looking more significant intellectual disabilities, significant or severe behavioral and emotional challenges, autism, multiple disabilities. Then we have the deaf and hard of hearing credential, and that one focuses on students who are deaf and or hard of hearing. And we have the visual impairments credential, and with that credential you are able to work with infants, toddlers, children, and youth who are blind and or visually impaired, including those with multiple disabilities. Students with multiple disabilities and a visual impairment are usually said to have a comorbid disability. Comorbid signifies that you have 2 disabilities affecting a person. Then we have, let's see here, early childhood special education. And with that, again, you are allowed to teach students 0 to 5 who would benefit from a special education program, regardless, again, of the category under which they are served. And within this category, it ranges from mild to severe, including multiple disabilities. And the really nice part about early childhood special education credentials is that there is a huge family component that teachers, early childhood special education teachers, really have to work with the family and really work within the factors that the family has. And then we have our last one, which is physical and health impairment credential. And this credential primarily focuses on students with the primary disability of orthopedic impairment or other health impairments as stated by California. Okay, so those are kind of like our credentials in a nutshell. So now let's segue to the big message that I want to make sure everyone walks away with, and that is that as teachers, we do not diagnose disabilities. Again, as teachers, we do not diagnose anything. Our main role in this assessment process is to truly look at students and determine their educational needs, regardless of whatever label they may have attached to them or whatever eligibility they might qualify under. As a teacher, our main job is to look at what a student needs in order to access the curriculum and where the breakdown is occurring. That is our main focus, okay? So I'm going to begin our process with individualized family service plan, or an IFSP. Okay, so an IFSP, just think of it as you have a baby, and as the baby develops, you may notice perhaps a couple of idiosyncrasies. Maybe the your baby isn't developmentally where they should be. Maybe they're, a late walker, or they're not speaking. You're just have a couple of concerns. And as a parent, you or a guardian, you go ahead and reach out to regional center. And regional center will go ahead and send someone to your home, and they will go ahead and conduct a series of assessments to see if your concerns are valid and what can be done to support you and the child. Okay. Now, you see two arrows here, there are two possible outcomes. The first outcome is option one: the student or the child is found to be developing appropriately and no further action is needed. Perhaps that's just something that's happening, and the assessments though show that the child will is okay. However, option two, which is right here, there's a red circle around it. The student is found to not be developing appropriately, or they're not meeting their typical milestones within a timely manner. And again, like I said before, perhaps there's delay in walking, talking, playing, whatever it may be. If the assessments do show that the child is not meeting their typical developmental milestones, an IFSP document will be created, and with that, other action plans. So, what is in an IFSP? Well, it is similar to an IEP, and again, like I stated, it is specifically geared for children ages 0 to 3. And these are for students with an obvious disability or are considered at risk if there isn't an early intervention put into place. And the really nice thing about an IFSP is that it focuses on the needs of the family, and it really truly provides assistance. Um, if the child is eligible for early childhood special education services, that is also discussed within this document. And interventions can include home based services, center based services, or a mixed service focusing on social skills or speech language supports. Again, everything is truly analyzed and made available to the student and the family. Okay. Um, Again, within this individualized family service plan, we do look at a child's present level of functioning and what are their needs, and they look at the areas of physical, cognitive, communication, social, emotional, and adaptive development. They also do a kind of a history of the family, and they kind of go through, perhaps are there siblings within the family that had a speech delay or autism or whatever it may be, the nature of the family history. It's really important that that is discussed and placed within the IFSP. Then during when that document is being created, specific early intervention services are discussed and listed, the time and location of the services that will be provided for the child, as well as the number of days or hours they will receive each service, and most importantly, who is paying for this. Okay? So, why early intervention? Why is it so important? Why does it matter to provide early intervention services to the child and to the family? Well, honestly, it is the best remedy to address students who are at risk. It also reduces the future cost of special education, rehabilitation, and healthcare needs. It also reduces the feelings of isolation, stress, and frustration that many families may experience because when you get connected with regional center, they really truly hold your hand as a family, and they help you meet with others that perhaps other families that may be in a similar situation. Again, it also helps children with disabilities grow up to become productive, independent individuals, and it does strengthen families' capacity to advocate and care for their child with special needs. So it truly, there are multiple benefits all around as to why it's so important to provide early intervention for children who may be at risk. Okay, so what happens once the child turns 3? Well, that is a really good question. The student becomes essentially the responsibility of the local school district, and a legal document or agreement is created that summarizes the meeting, the exit, and then, as you might guess, that is considered an individual education program, or an IEP, or an individual education plan. This IEP is reviewed once a year by the school team and anyone that is involved with the student's educational program. Okay, let me go ahead and just kind of, one thing that I really want to focus on is this graphic right here. So let's say that at the age of 3, again, the child is assessed and it is determined that, you know what, they have made adequate progress. They are meeting all their developmental milestones and everything is kosher. Then the child is basically exited out and they will not follow the path of receiving an IEP. However, if the child is assessed at the age of 3 and yes, they have made progress, but not sufficient enough to where concerns are still lingering, then an individualized education plan is created. So, what is contained within this? Well, a description of the child's present level of performance, i.e., how are they doing in the area of reading or literacy, math, whatever it may be. And then annual goals and short-term objectives are written that the child, to help the child make progress. A description of how the student will be evaluated, including strategies, preferred mode of communication, whatever that may be, as well as the student's educational placement. And again, this is really important to highlight that the a student's educational placement should be discussed with the whole entire team, all of those that are present at the meeting. This is not by any means one person making this decision. This is a whole entire group discussion, and a team consensus need to be made by everyone in regards to where they feel the child will receive the most benefit within their education. Okay, and then in addition to that, the discussion of the placement, special education, and any other related services that the child is to receive are also written in the IEP. And I'm not going to lie, some IEPs can be up to 100 pages long. They are it's a very intense legal document that, just think of it as kind of a map to, or a guide that will help you understand a student with significant learning challenges. In addition to everything listed here, an IEP will also include the extent of participation in general education. And if you recall from the Shonda Smith consent decree, that was a very important component that, as a safeguard, everyone wanted to ensure that that was a discussion to ensure that the option of no participation in general education was an automatic. Even though, like I said, I'm still seeing, children still in sometimes hardly getting any general education interaction. Let's see right here. Okay. In addition to that, there's also a discussion of place in the IEP where discussion of accommodations and modifications needed for the student to access the curriculum. They're listed there. Perhaps if the student needs assistive technology, so perhaps they need um, what is it, a text to speech or anything else to ensure that they're able to access the curriculum, a communication device, big buttons, whatever it may be, as well as a behavior intervention plan if needed. Just because a student may have an IEP, that does not mean automatically that that their area of concern is behavior. Some students, though, do require supports in that area, so it is really important to be very specific in regards to the behaviors, the antecedents, and what are some strategies that will support the student to decrease the challenging behavior and increase the appropriate behavior. Within the IEP, we also have the date of initiation, the frequency in which the child will receive special education services, and any duration of the service. Okay. And again, I just want to make it very clear that this is a legal agreement between the school district and the student's parents or guardians, and or the student if they are 18 or older. So again, it's really important that you understand, the legalities of signing an IEP. Okay. Let's go ahead and go on to individualized transition plan. Guys, we are almost done. Hang in there. So an individualized education plan, or an ITP, focuses on what services and supports a student will need as they prepare to leave the public educational system. So even though the child is nowhere near being 18, these talks within the family and the IEP team are very important. And usually I started this conversation and this process as soon as the student turned 13, but by the time they're 14, this should already be in place. And the ITP truly is, it is started by the age of 14, and it is continuously revised each year consecutively after, to begin developing and really adding to the plans. Some families may envision their child with a disability, living on their own and being as independent as possible. That may not necessarily be the case for other families where their child, will probably require all around care for their daily living needs. So again, the ITP is very important, and it is just a way to transition into adulthood and make it as smoothly as possible for not only the student, but the family as well. Okay, so a little more information here about the ITP. It's completed in conjunction with an IEP. It's not separate. So when you hold the annual IEP, you also have it used to be the last 3 pages of the IEP, but if I'm not mistaken, I believe that it's gotten longer. It's put in place so students with disabilities and their parents can become more involved in writing their own transition plan instead of educational staff making those decisions for the family and the child. And again, it helps students to prepare for life after high school. Okay, thank you so much for hanging in there with me. For next week, which will be September 17th, you should already have read Chapter 2, which is Settings in Morawski-Spencer textbook. And please go ahead and read Studer 2011 Neurodevelopmental Framework, which is already uploaded onto Canvas. I will see everyone September 17th. Hopefully you don't forget what I look like. I feel like we've been gone for a really long time. But have a wonderful day, and see you next week. Bye.